Welcome to Meet the Ocean. I'm your host, Paul North, and today we journey down to the southernmost continent on planet Earth. That's right, we're taking you back to Antarctica. But instead of talking about ice or penguins, we'll be hearing a story about predators. Killer whales, to be exact, and we'll be investigating the intelligence and coordination that they possess in order to hunt in a particularly unique manner. As you might imagine, conducting science on such large creatures in such cold and distant waters is extremely difficult. But there is still so much left to discover. That's why doctors Bob Pittman, John Durbin, and Holly Fernbach have dedicated decades in order to unravel the mysteries and potentially define the varying ecotypes of killer whales in Antarctica as unique species.
So our satellite tagging work has shown that these whales, maybe a couple of times a year, undertake these fast trips to the subtropics.
This is Frontline Science. It's brilliant and it is bold. And you can hear all about it in our podcast, Episode 3, Killer Whale Science in Antarctica. Now, before we jump in, a quick reminder that Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported podcast and nonprofit. We rely on our community of listeners to support our effort to inform the public and improve science communication concerning our saltwater ecosystems. For as little as $1 a month, you can join our Patreon community and become part of a growing network of ocean supporters that have access to art, photography, and behind-the-scenes content. And now, on to our episode.
Meet the ocean.
My name is Rory Mulloy. I'm an undersea specialist on board the National Geographic Explorer, and I want to talk to you about an incredible wildlife encounter we had a few days ago down in Antarctica in the Antarctic Peninsula. We were just north of Petermann Island, and we came across a pod of killer whales, a small pod of killer whales. It was our naturalist Eduardo Shaw who first spotted them, and he spotted them spy hopping through the pack ice. We immediately thought or assumed that they were type B killer whales, so pack ice killer whales, and these are large type B killer whales. So this particular ecotype of killer whale specializes in hunting seals. And on one of the ice floes that they were spy hopping around was a crab-eater seal, as it turned out. Initially there was some discussion, there's some thought that it might be a Weddell seal, because generally this ecotype of killer whale will target Weddell seals, which are substantially larger than crab-eaters, so presumably offer a little bit more sustenance for them to share around. Anyway, as the ship approached the killer whales slowly, we saw more spy hopping behavior. Many of the naturalists and guests on board were eagerly rushing to grab their cameras and binoculars and head to the bow of the ship, and we saw more and more spy hopping behavior, and we were counting around 4 or 5 killer whales. When we got a bit closer, we realized it was 4, with one smaller, younger killer whale, so possibly a calf, learning to hunt in this way. As we got closer and the killer whales had identified a seal on the ice floe, we began witnessing this wave washing hunting technique that has been documented a couple of times before, but quite exceptional to see happening in real life in the wild. So what these killer whales do is they'll swim just below the surface at increasing speed towards the ice floe where the seal is perched, and as they swim just below the surface, kind of waving their tail up and down, they'll create this pressure wave, like a large ripple through the water, that will wash over the ice floe, disrupt the balance of the ice floe obviously, and wash over the ice floe, and they're attempting to wash the seal off the ice floe into the water where it's more vulnerable and where the killer whales have a chance to grab it and kill it, essentially. So we saw this happen a couple of times, and the seal managed to hold on to the ice floe. It was a relatively small ice floe, and there was a kind of mounting air of tension on the bow and on the bridge, that we might actually get to see a predation in the wild, which you can have a lot of exciting wildlife encounters, seeing whales porpoising at the surface, or humpback whales breaching, or even killer whales just kind of cruising along. But to to encounter a group of predators, a group of apex predators like killer whales on the verge of predating on a seal is something quite exceptional and something that a lot of our guests were incredibly excited about. So there was an air of anticipation, some nerves. I think initially there was a little bit of sympathy for the seal, but most people were probably had that bloodthirsty excitement to see a predation in real life and see these killer whales use their incredible strength and knowledge and incredible intelligence to take down the seal. So anyway, as the encounter developed, the killer whales would try this wave washing technique and the seal would cling on, and they'd kind of circle back round, they'd spy hop next to the ice to check that he was still there. And in one of their early attempts, they washed the wrong ice floe. And so as the killer whales were popping up around the ice floe to check the seal, they realized that they targeted the wrong piece of ice. And so what was really interesting in this encounter was they seemed to be moving the ice floe where the seal was lying. They seemed to move that into a kind of open body of water so that they wouldn't get confused by other ice floes possibly. And so it was easier for them to target this ice floe. And once they had this ice floe isolated, they would circle back around and they would come in again with another wave, with another pressure wave. And I can't remember which one it was, maybe the third or fourth wave, they washed him off, and there was a gasp from a collective gasp from the bow and everyone on board, and a kind of silence waiting for that bloody, bubbly mess after the killer whales had got him. But he leapt out of the water onto the ice floe, and there was this kind of cheer from the group that everybody was relieved, I guess, that they hadn't witnessed this poor killer whale get torn apart by this poor seal, get torn apart by these killer whales. And the killer whales would pop up and they'd be just behind him, so just as he dived out of the water on the ice floe, a killer whale would pop up their head and you could see just how close they were to grabbing him. And then they'd circle back round and they'd try it again. Over the course of this encounter, we witnessed, I think we counted afterwards, up to 35 attempts to wash this seal off the ice floe. And again, he would either hold on, or just when you thought the pressure wave was powerful enough to wash him off and he dropped off into the water, you thought the killer whales would come up with him in their grasp, he would dart out of the water onto the ice floe again, to huge cheers from the crowd. And as the encounter went on, more and more people seemed to get behind the seal and were just won over by his determination to survive, his willingness to battle on despite almost inevitable death. And the whole group got behind him, even naming him Kevin at one point. I'm not sure where the name came from, but after a while there were people shouting, "Go Kevin!" every time he jumped out of the water. And I don't know if you heard us cheering him on, but he really seemed to do everything possible to stave off this impending predation. Eventually the killer whales kind of seemed to change tactic a little bit, whether they just thought we've got to try something else, or they knew it wasn't working, but they would pause from producing these pressure waves, and then they would kind of come up and nudge the ice a little bit, blow some bubbles around the ice, and they actually began moving the ice around. We're not quite sure whether to break the ice flow up or whether just to intimidate the seal, but it was amazing to see these creatures act intelligently or try different techniques instead of just trying the same thing over and over again. It seemed like they were trying to work out a way to get this seal. And what's interesting is since this encounter, we've been sent a paper by some killer whale researchers who have been on this ship numerous times, Robert Pittman and John Durbin. And it was a paper they wrote about observations they made of pack ice killer whale pods hunting and predating in Antarctica. And the majority of the encounters they found, killer whales would ignore crab-eater seals. Most of the kills they made, I think 14 out of 15 identified kills while they were observing these pods, were on Weddell seals. So when it became apparent that this seal we were watching was a crab-eater seal, it was even more interesting because it's not, from what we know, their normal target prey. So we wonder whether perhaps crab-eater seals are more agile, perhaps they're slightly better at evading the killer whales, more quicker in the water. But what's also interesting is that Robert Pittman and John Durbin mentioned that these killer whales, when they come down to the Antarctic waters, the colder water actually forces killer whales to draw blood away from their extremities, to draw blood away from their eyes, and their eyesight is supposedly a little bit worse, so they might not actually be able to accurately identify the seal on the floe. Time and time again, the killer whales would come in with this wake wash, and every single time the crowd thought, this is it, this is the last time, this is bye-bye Kevin. And there were people saying, oh, is there going to be blood? Is it going to be gory? I don't want to watch. And there was this kind of inevitable expectation that the seal would meet its grim end. And just at the point when he fell into the water after this one wake wash, and the killer whales were circling, we thought, that's it, it's over. He darted towards the boat and went under the ship, I should say. He darted towards the ship, went under the bow of the ship, followed by this pod of killer whales, and the ship visibly moved as like hordes of people rushed over to the port side. The seal ducked under the ship. All the passengers and naturalists charged over to the starboard side, and he popped out the starboard side and darted away towards these ice floes like a little fast-moving slug, like a slug in fast forward through the water, and then popped out onto another ice floe. And there was a huge cheer from the ship, and those at the bow who couldn't see what happened immediately knew that Kevin the seal had evaded death again, jumped onto this ice floe. However, this second ice floe was, I think, maybe a single-year piece of fast ice, so it was not as sturdy as the first ice floe he'd been on. And once again, the killer whales would try this wave wash technique, and it began to break up quite quickly. So time was running out for our poor seal Kevin, and I'm sure he was running out of steam and energy, diving back out of the water every time. And eventually we thought, oh, there's nothing left for him, as the ice floe broke up and he was hiding between two fragments of the same broken piece of ice. And just as the killer whales came up, spy hopped one more time, circled round, and were heading off away from the ice floe in preparation for another pressure wave, Kevin, our seal, dipped his little head into the water and took his chance, and he darted off in the other direction, and all you could see was a slight ripple at the surface as he headed off into the distance, heading out presumably to find a larger piece of ice. And before the killer whales knew what happened, they came back around, they washed the ice floe again, popped up, spy hopped, see where the seal was, and they saw he was gone. And you could see them very differently to how they'd reacted after previous attempts. They kind of dispersed a little bit, looking for him in kind of frantic fashion, swimming around, especially the younger calf, swimming around the ice floes, spy hopping, looking around. So they'd obviously lost sight of him. And we didn't see what happened to poor Kevin the seal, but it seemed like he got away. And there was this huge victorious cheer from the crowd and everyone watching on the ship, and it was quite exciting to be part of that encounter and actually see throughout the whole period, of however many wave washes it was. I think we counted 35. That what people wanted to happen completely changed. There was this, at the beginning, there was this kind of excitement to witness this predation, but as this poor seal developed this kind of personality in front of her eyes and this character, everybody's opinions completely changed, and people started cheering for the seal. And by the end, there was this kind of sense of relief, but also this sense of this wonder that we'd seen a truly remarkable encounter. I mean, 35 attempts to wash this seal off the ice floe. In this same paper by Robert Pittman and John Durbin, in I think 15 seal kills they witnessed, on average, this group of pack ice killer whales would produce somewhere between 1 and 10 attempts to wash them off, and we'd seen somewhere in the number of 35. So it's just incredible to see the resilience of this seal, but also the kind of harsh, brutal truth of what it's like to live in the Antarctic for a simple seal, and how close you are to death constantly. So it was a phenomenal encounter, and one I think that our passengers and even our naturalists will never forget.
Meet the Ocean is produced by Paul North and Andrew Gettings, with sound design by Kelsey Anderson and music by Vin Gast. Special thanks to polar expedition diver Rory Mulloy for recounting the tale of wave-washing killer whales in Antarctica. We are a listener-supported nonprofit. You can find more podcasts, underwater creatures, and ways to donate to our educational outreach on our website, meettheocean.org. Subscribe to our podcast to never miss an episode, support us on Patreon, and please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you choose to listen. Until next time, may the saltwater be with you.